and also for notices of motions given orally to allow for the Prime Minister to make a statement. May it please you, Madam Speaker.
Members, the question is that we have the recommittal of the items, statements by ministers and notices of motions given orally. Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. Statements by ministers. Prime Minister, the Honourable Andrew Holness.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, you would know that we are now in graduation season. And Madam Speaker, I do have one such event to attend, but the nation's business comes first, even though the graduation is special to me. Madam Speaker, I will therefore try to move through very quickly. And though I have not said it, I ask for the understanding of the House. Madam Speaker, I intend to table today in this Honourable House a green paper and a ministry paper containing job descriptions for members of Parliament and for ministers of government, respectively. But before I table them, Madam Speaker, I want to set out the broader national context of what this government is doing in terms of the reform of the public sector and the public bureaucracy. Madam Speaker, I can say without equivocation and without fear of contradiction that this government has undertaken the most ambitious and far-reaching programs of transformation and reform since our independence. Madam Speaker, fiscal and monetary reforms, including work to establish the Fiscal Commission and the independence of the central bank. The only indication, Madam Speaker, that we need to show in this House is that our debt to GDP ratio is now at 74%. 74%. And I hear the complaints of the people, but I would like to say to them, Madam Speaker, your government is doing what is necessary to address the issues that affect you. But we do them in systematic, logical, cohesive, strategic ways that when the change happens, it lifts all ships in the harbor. Not just some are over there or over there. Everybody's lifted at once. That's why we do transformational reforms, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, we have reformed the financial management of public bodies. You know, Madam Speaker, 5 years ago, well, no, 10 years ago, a decade ago, before we took over, the government was always at risk of some fiscal shock internally due to a poorly run public body. Madam Speaker, when last have you heard of a public body to the government? We have transformed that. There are, I hear the leader of the opposition, there are institutions that could be. But Madam Speaker, we have put in place the mechanisms to manage them. Madam Speaker, we just need to look at the Water Commission and how, for the first time, you hear that the Water Commission has turned a profit. Madam Speaker, we are transforming our public infrastructure with massive projects in new highways, local roads, water, sewage, and parks, without question. Right. And in as much as we hear the complaints about the local roads, Madam Speaker, if the truth be told, no other administration has done the work that we have done in building and improving infrastructure. Madam Speaker, transformation of the housing and shelter sector. leading to more housing solutions coming to the market at a faster pace. Madam Speaker, when you look around Kingston, you drive into Mandeville, you're going to Montego Bay, all you can see, Madam Speaker, is construction, people building. Madam Speaker, the transformation of our urban spaces by developing purpose-built urban centers to accommodate commerce, production, residences, and recreation is underway in full force, Madam Speaker. You know, I invite the leader of the opposition to just tour Bernard Lodge and see how that is building out nicely. Madam Speaker, he should take a tour down to the Morant Bay Urban Center to see how that is building out nicely. And we have, Madam Speaker, Boundbrook in Portland ready to come in a few months, and a few others that were on the books are now reaching that point where they can be deployed. Madam Speaker, the modernization of our laws and the infrastructure and public transportation that gave us some problems a few months ago. But the new law is in place. The new trafficking ticket system is in place and is working. And we are seeing the impact. Road accidents, crashes are slowly decreasing. But over time, you will begin to see the improvement and the impact because this administration has had the guts, has had the strength to put in place, don't worry about it, to put in place the measures, Madam Speaker, to ensure that the quality of life, which includes how you are able to traverse in the country, is improved. Madam Speaker, in a few months, we will have our smart buses on the road. And I know the complaints regarding public passenger transport. The rolling stock that we have has been depleted. But we're not just going to replace it with the conventional rolling stock, Madam Speaker. We're going to replace them with smarter, better rolling stock. We're going to replace them with electric buses, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, we have engaged in the unprecedented capacity building and service orientation transformation of the JDF and the JCF, both in personnel, leadership, doctrine, infrastructure, material and equipment and technology. Madam Speaker, when we visited with the JCF in their display that they had at the arena, I felt proud, as all Jamaicans who visited felt proud of the JCF. Our JCF is transforming before our very eyes. Madam Speaker, the long-needed transformation of our education system is now underway. And related to that, the transformation of the Heart Trust NSTA to become more closely aligned with the skills demands of industry, that has already begun. Madam Speaker, you can feel the impact of the government's recent move to ensure that all Jamaicans can access skills training without paying a fee. Madam Speaker, we are seeing an increase in the interest of our young people in getting skills training. Madam Speaker, we have begun the long talked about reform of our constitutional arrangements. What is the lesson from all of these reforms? And I've just given you a partial list. The lesson is, Madam Speaker, is that others talk about it. Some wish it could happen. Some dream of it. Some tell you that they have a pipeline. But it is this administration, Madam Speaker, that is doing. It is this administration, Madam Speaker, that is getting things done. It is this administration that is making changes in the country. Change, Madam Speaker, is never easy. Never easy. And there is always, Madam Speaker, a creature called a political entrepreneur. Who is that person? The political entrepreneur exists in the gap between implementation and results. While you are implementing, you don't see the results. And so the political entrepreneur takes advantage of the gap between implementation and results to try to tell the public that it won't happen, that it's not going to happen. They try to mislead the public. They try to monetize. There's a term that they use. They monetize misinformation and they monetize discontent. And we are noting, Madam Speaker, that there are many political entrepreneurs around. So, Madam Speaker, don't worry. I'm just, Madam Speaker, you notice how animated that side is, Madam Speaker. You notice how animated that side is. But, Madam Speaker, you have the political entrepreneurs who will try to take advantage, Madam Speaker. But, Madam Speaker, we have been pursuing change without fear. It takes courage to do that. A member on that side stood in this house and said something very profound, former chairman of the PNP. You cannot have change without confrontation. He said that, stood right there. And it means, Madam Speaker, that as we seek to change Jamaica, we will come up against deep-seated beliefs, perspectives that have been well established.
Prime Minister, your time for speaking has expired.
Madam Speaker, I beg to move that the Prime Minister's time be extended sufficiently for him to complete his statement.
Members, the question before the House is that the Prime Minister be given sufficient time to complete his presentation. Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. Prime Minister.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank the members of the House. I see the opposition is enjoying the presentation. I agree. Madam Speaker, despite the magnitude and far-reaching scale of the reforms, the constant cry from the people is that the government is not implementing fast enough. How do we accelerate the pace of implementation? We are all aware that as a country for decades we have faced an implementation deficit. We are a nation full of creative and innovative ideas and solutions, but we have consistently fallen down in implementation. Why is this? For decades, we have slowly depleted the capacity of the public service. And when I say capacity, I do not necessarily mean the number of persons. I mean the capabilities, competencies, skills, and enterprise, most importantly, enterprise and motivation of the public service. Madam Speaker, for decades, we have undervalued and underinvested in the public service. As a country, we have faced a brain drain for a long time now, with many of our best and brightest leaving the country. The public sector has faced a double whammy, losing staff not only as a result of migration overseas, but locally to the private sector. For many years, the most promising civil servants because they do not see the compensation as benefiting their qualification or befitting their potential. The work of the ministries, Madam Speaker, is highly dependent on their leadership as well as the quality of their supporting staff. Many permanent secretaries oversee and manage budgets that exceed the size of those in large private sector companies. They make consequential decisions, but for decades, we have undervalued them and the critical roles they play. We are not going to be able to achieve the transformations that we need in this country, and importantly, at the speed at which we need to achieve them, without attracting more of our best minds and talent into the public service, both at the administrative level and at the level of the political directorate. This is why we have undertaken the most comprehensive restructuring of the public sector in our history. Right through from the very bottom of the scale to the top of the scale. Successive governments have spoken about the critical importance of doing this, and there were several attempts in the past to simplify the compensation system and adjust wages to approximate market salaries. In the mid-1980s, there was the Administrative Reform Program. This was only focused on the salaries of senior-level public workers and their support staff. It was not universally applied to the public sector. In the mid-1990s, there was an agreement to move public sector salaries to 80% of market. That is the origin of the promise to the teachers by the administration of the day that teachers would be moved to 80% of market. This was not done at the time. It was partially done for some public sector groups, but not for the teachers. In 2000s, in the early 2000s, the government of the day implemented 2 tranches of the increases that were proposed in the 90s for the central government, but then had to suspend further increases, and in fact, implemented a wage freeze shortly thereafter in 2004. Those of you who were in the parliament would recall that that was the first time in a long time that MPs and ministers' salaries were raised in 2002. Back then, there was a similar outcry, and the Prime Minister Patterson at the time, as was the suggestion that was done time and time before, he empaneled the Clark Committee to review the salary increases occasioned by the commitment of increasing central government salaries to 80% of market. But you know what happened, Madam Speaker? When the Clark Committee tabled its report, you know what the government of the day did? They appointed a special parliamentary group headed by the Minister of Finance to review the committee, to determine what in that committee would be accepted and what would not be accepted. Now, mind you, some good things came out of it. For example, the subvention that MPs get now to supplement their offices was as a result of that. And some other changes were made. But, Madam Speaker, the point to note here is that if each time there has to be a salary increase for the parliament, then we have to go put in a committee and then a committee to review a committee, that doesn't change the fundamental issue, because here we are again, 20 years later, without any adjustment to market, debating the same issue. While the public has a legitimate view about its politicians and their deservingness of being paid, we need to lead the public in the correct understanding of the issues. We are cast in an old mold of looking at our problems. And one thing we know is that the old approaches that got us into the problem in the first place will not get us out of the problem. And if you have been trying the same thing over and over again and the problem still exists, you know what Albert Einstein said about that? We have to take a different approach. It really does hurt me personally, Madam Speaker, when I listen to the public discourse. Because, yes, it makes common sense, but it is not common intelligence. How are we going to solve these problems if we take the ordinary and reflex approach? When other countries with similar challenges like us and I dare say point out Singapore, they took a different approach to the problem. And they got a far better result. Well, not just Singapore, we have New Zealand as well. But more to come. Because as your former chairman said, leadership requires that even if you become unpopular, you must stand up and confront the people. Because my interest is for the betterment of the people of Jamaica. And those who continue to feed into the common sense without leading with intelligence do not mean the people of this country any good. They do not mean you any good. It is only political entrepreneurism. So, Madam Speaker, in 2008, the Golding administration brought teachers, I want this to be on the record, in 2008, the commitment that was made in the 1990s, we took the decision to bring teachers up to 80% of market. We also started the process of the adjustment for the health sector, and that process was implemented in 2013. But you know what happened after that, Madam Speaker? The government had to implement a wage freeze. None of the previous adjustments that were made to salaries were ever comprehensive, and none of them were sustainable. In fact, due to the country's fiscal state, rounds of compensation adjustments were followed by rounds of high inflation, financial crises, and the implementation of wage freezes, which eroded the value of the increased salaries and made public sector salaries uncompetitive. So we got caught in a cycle. And that's why we are here today. This is the first time in our economic history that any government has substantially and sustainably adjusted compensation at the scale and at the pace being undertaken by this government. That is without contradiction, without fear of criticism. This administration has done that. Madam Speaker, regardless of what you hear about who is complaining about what, who didn't get this amount of increase and anomalies and all the attempts to mislead, the fact is that over $100 billion has been added to the wage bill to reasonably approximate market compensation. $100 billion. Now you tell me which other government has done that. You can talk about caring for the people. You can talk about you love the people. You can talk about that you're going to do for the people. But this government has allocated in its budget $100 billion of sustainable increases to the salaries of the public sector workers of this country. Not talk, action. Action. And what we hear, Madam Speaker, is who didn't get and who didn't get enough. But you know what didn't come out? How many people are now using their what you call it, the retroactive. You see, I didn't take any retroactive, so I don't even know what it look like. Buying cars, paying down on houses, adding on to their house, increasing their savings. One teacher told me that she now can hire, Madam Speaker, she now can hire a little helper to take care of her child and mother, give her mother a break. These are some of the changes and improvement in the quality of life of the people, because the government has run the country so well that it can give you a salary increase without worrying that next year you're going to get wage freeze. And that is why, Madam Speaker, it burned me when I hear I stand in this parliament, Madam Speaker, and say that all the lies and misinformation that is being spewed by the political entrepreneurs, that this government is not going to sit back. You hear what the member said over there? He said, oh, this sounds like 2015. Madam Speaker, let it be well known that this Prime Minister has the ability, anytime I feel to turn it on, to get back in the public domain and let the people know that we will not be misled. Madam Speaker, I was just ruling. Madam Speaker, Madam Speaker, I was just ruling. Because while they are out there spreading lies and misinformation, we were busy working. Madam Speaker, don't worry about that. Madam Speaker, not only have we increased, I won't deal with that part of it too, because some people want elections. Don't worry, careful what you wish for. Madam Speaker, not only have we increased the wage of the average public sector worker, but we have also improved, Madam Speaker, we have improved the human resource management system around public sector jobs and compensation reform. Long-standing inequities and anomalies have been or are being resolved. It is a painstaking exercise, and I know that some of our public sector workers feel that they are not being heard or that the process is taking too long. We must always bear in mind that in resolving the anomalies, we cannot create new inequities and complexities. Our public sector workers can be assured of our commitment to keep working through their concerns to reach a satisfactory resolution. Madam Speaker, the restructuring and realignment of public sector compensation is just the beginning of a multi-year journey towards improving the efficiency and effectiveness of both the administrative and political arms of our public service. There are those who hold the view that public service, particularly the political side of it, must be a calling, and those who offer themselves must do so without expectation of commensurate remuneration. There are others, Madam Speaker, who believe that there is no need to properly pay public servants, particularly politicians, because they will supplement their income through informal, opaque, or corrupt means. This is the commonly shared thinking that has driven our approach to compensating holders of public office, both administrative and political, in this country since independence. Where has it gotten us? Where? Are we any more efficient? Is our service any better because we have been paying public servants and politicians less? While we must acknowledge that these views are not without some groundings in our history and lived experience, there comes a time in the life of any society where we must approach the problem from a different angle and apply new thinking and perspectives. Madam Speaker, if Jamaica is to achieve its immense potential, we must change the philosophy that has guided our approach to public sector compensation since our independence. It is crucial to recognize the importance of professionalizing the public service through commensurate compensation and enforcement of standards, rather than relying on the altruism of the public servants and the chance that they will make the best effort in serving the country. That's what we're changing. That is the core of what we are trying to do. And yes, the history of the country suggests that politicians have not always been faithful to the standards. Public servants have not always been faithful to the standards. But there comes a time when there is change, and the country must recognize that we are changing this dynamic. If it's one thing that will happen as a result of this administration, is that this problem is now solved. No other generation has to deal with it, regardless of the political cost. The history books will be kind to us. While the spirit of selflessness and dedication to the nation are necessary and admirable attributes, depending on them alone is not a sustainable approach to building a competent and efficient public sector. Offering competitive and fair compensation is necessary in improving the motivation of the office holder. It relieves the strain of everyday life and lessens the distracting and debilitating impact of personal financial security on worker output. Reasonable compensation allows public servants to meet their financial obligations, reducing the temptation for corruption, thereby preserving integrity in public institutions. The adjusted compensation will attract and retain essential talent in the public sector, particularly those who are public service oriented, but could not sustain themselves at the old compensation levels. Now, theoretically, we expect that adequate remuneration incentivizes high performance and ensures a diverse pool of qualified workers to increase output and service. However, Madam Speaker, we know that this is not automatically so. Along with improved compensation, there must also be a well-articulated and transparent performance measurement and accountability framework. The other side of the compensation reform, which we have just completed, which is to do all the job descriptions and peg salaries to market and put in place a hierarchy of salary scales. The other side of the compensation reform is the implementation of the performance-based system and an accountability framework. And this was agreed to be implemented in the next 2 years. So, Madam Speaker, in the debate on public sector compensation, there are those who have expressed the view that they take no issue with fair and reasonable market-based compensation, including the political directorate, but the accountability for governance and performance should come first. While I understand this perspective, given the scale and complexity of the reform and the need to strike agreement with so many circumstantially diverse bargaining units, it would be impractical and possibly could delay the full implementation of the reform. The better course of action is, as we have adopted, to implement the adjusted compensation element first. We have the other element lined up and it's being executed now, it's being developed. Madam Speaker, the development of a performance-based system of remuneration is a very complex and potentially contentious undertaking. It took us from 2017 to now to do the compensation review, just to initiate it, get the consultants, do all the work. But Madam Speaker, the very act of developing the compensation review in terms of, as I said, doing the job descriptions with compensable elements creates a framework and gives you targets against which effort can be measured. So in effect, Madam Speaker, we already start to see the outlines of what could become the performance-based and accountability framework. So once we have a system that rewards workers by the merit of their efforts and the weight of their responsibilities in achieving total output, then compensation must be aligned with effort and responsibility. So we're almost there. So we have done the alignments with effort and responsibility. We have outlined the jobs. We have looked at what elements should be compensated in the jobs. We are now at a point where we have to put in place a system now of setting agreed targets and how they are measured and what portion of compensation would be assigned to efforts. And that, it takes up negotiation. You have to work with the unions. You have to test out the systems. You have to put in place the technology that is going to do it. It takes a little time, but we're giving ourselves 2 years to get that element in place. So, Madam Speaker, the first part of the compensation review, adjusting salaries and establishing non-overlapping scales that account for the hierarchy of responsibility, control, and direction, has largely set the framework for a performance-based system to be fully developed and implemented. Madam Speaker, in my first term, I announced my intention to have job letters published for ministers and what has not been said, but internally, we started a process of developing a performance-based system to be first applied to permanent secretaries. This was running in parallel with the consultancy work on the compensation review. So, Madam Speaker, we were actually going to start the performance-based system before we started the compensation. We thought about it from that perspective. And I did indicate that we would put out job letters, meaning job descriptions as they are called. But, Madam Speaker, after careful consideration, it was agreed with the Ministry of Finance that it would be more efficient, it would be a more efficient use of resources and more effective management to roll all efforts into universal reform of the public service, including the job letters for ministers and the executive level performance-based system. And it made good sense, Madam Speaker. Instead of doing it in a piecemeal way where we do a piece here and we do a piece there, put it together in one systematic effort. Because you really need to have, as I said before, the hierarchy of responsibilities that match compensation. So as a result, in 2019, instructions were given to prepare these job descriptions for ministers, and the Transformation Implementation Unit submitted a draft in 2021 after the dislocation of the COVID-19 pandemic. The notion that reform is piecemeal or puts the cart before the horse is totally wrong. While we have not been able to communicate all that we have been doing, as several elements are not mature to the point where they could become a reality, the transformation unfolding before our eyes is the most significant and comprehensive effort ever undertaken in the history of Jamaica to achieve an efficient and effective public sector. Madam Speaker, my government is committed to the highest standards of governance for this country. Good governance includes the conduct and performance of our ministers, our members of parliament, the members of the civil service, and the broader public service. The country must have a clear sense of what is required for parliamentarians and ministers. Madam Speaker, I am tabling today job descriptions for members of parliament, and this is being tabled as a green paper. And for ministers, we are tabling their job descriptions, and this is being tabled as a white paper. So the white paper, Madam Speaker, is already determined. It is now government policy. The green paper, the committee to be established will have the opportunity to review, make amendments, and to finalize. These will set out strategic objectives of the post, its purpose, reporting and accountability, the key deliverables and responsibility areas, performance standards, competencies, contacts, and the working conditions. In proposing a job description, we are not suggesting anything new or outside our laws and constitution. However, few people have a full appreciation of what the appointment requires or the election to be a member of parliament requires. It is hoped that this job description will help members of the public better appreciate and understand the roles and responsibilities of ministers and members of parliament. Madam Speaker, good governance also means holding our parliamentarians and ministers to the highest standard of conduct. We will prepare, discuss, agree, and implement codes of conduct for parliamentarians and for ministers. It has been more than 20 years since the country turned its attention to a formal declaration of the conduct of ministers in Ministry Paper number 19, 2002. In that paper, the country was invited to accept the UK Nolan Committee's report or proposal of the 7 principles of public life, including selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and leadership. Those 7 principles are as enduring now as when they were first presented. However, we contemplate that we need to develop further guidance to implement those principles in a much better way. Every minister in the cabinet is bounded by the Code of Conduct in Ministry Paper 19, 2002. So I want that point, Madam Speaker, to be cemented. The cabinet is not without a code of conduct. There is a code of conduct that has existed for 20 years, which members on that side, when they were in the cabinet, were also bounded by. Madam Speaker, the principles of public life must apply to anyone in the public service or who works as a public office holder. Most especially, these principles must also apply to our members of parliament. The parliament, through its Joint Select Committee, will be invited to note the approved job description for ministers and further develop and refine the job description for members of parliament. Madam Speaker, Jamaica's challenges are not unique by any means. Many other countries face challenges in establishing codes of conduct for their parliamentarians. A quick survey would suggest that the following countries have discussed publicly or have established codes of conduct for their parliaments: Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada, France, Germany, Ghana, India, Japan, Kenya, Mexico, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Nigeria, Norway, South Africa, South Korea, Sweden, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Some codes are based on legislation, so the parliament actually passes a law, while others are found in whole or in part on parliamentary resolutions. And of course, many of these countries have not been able to implement the codes fully. So, Madam Speaker, it is a process. So codes are not developed overnight because many of the codes require consensus. The body for which the code is to be applied will sit and work through the codes, because it is in that process that the commitment to keeping the code, if it is not legislated, is established. So many of the countries that I have named here, they are in the process of establishing their codes and working through. So they may have settled on a code for certain behaviors in parliament, but they may not have resolved conflicts of interest as yet. So they are all working at various stages. Eventually, they will have a full set of guidelines and conducts for their members. If we focus on the Commonwealth countries, for example, as of March 2022, The Federal Parliament of Australia did not have a parliamentary code of conduct, although all but one Australian state and territory did. So some local parliaments have it, but the central parliament, the central government, the state parliament, the national parliament did not have it. So again, it can come in different forms. Madam Speaker, in the United Kingdom, there is a code of conduct for the House of Commons based on rules adopted in 2012. There were earlier resolutions setting codes of conduct in 1996 and 2002. The current style is to establish the code, setting out the purpose, scope, duties of the members, and general principles of conduct, being the Nolan principles, which I referred to earlier. The rules of conduct and upholding the code, Madam Speaker, is declared a matter for the Parliament, that is the UK Houses of Parliament, and they have a common standards committee that treats with these matters. So they have a code of conduct and they have a House committee that monitors and enforces the code of conduct. Madam Speaker, in 2013, Ghana established a code of conduct for its parliamentarians, essentially reinforcing the Nolan principles of selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and leadership. And again, Madam Speaker, the enforcement of the Ghanaian code of conduct is by its parliament. So, Madam Speaker, there are many examples, but this very short survey should remind us that Jamaica's journey towards establishing a code of conduct is not a unique one, but it is a journey that this parliament must start. Madam Speaker, the Joint Select Committee will also consider certain working documents towards developing our own code of conduct, which will include the ministry paper I alluded to earlier, Ministry Paper 19/2002. This code should set the standard for appropriate conduct and guide how the standards should be understood and interpreted. Most importantly, the code of conduct must hold the Houses of Parliament to enforce the conduct on their members. The development of the code of conduct is an important exercise in the agency and maturity of the Jamaican Parliament. It cannot be good for this institution that the society must tell us the standards to which we must adhere. We are not a parliament of children. We must be the body that leads the setting of standards and carry the people with us. This is what accountability means. It means we take responsibility for ourselves. The committee will also be asked to establish a reporting and accountability framework for members to include standard periodic reports to Parliament on the work of MPs in their constituencies, the use of public resources such as the CDF, and the engagements that the MPs have with constituents. The attendance and participation of members in the House and committees will also be tracked and action determined for absences beyond a set threshold. So, Madam Speaker, this committee will be asked to establish an accountability framework for how its members operate. We have to take charge of our own actions. We must show the public that we are working for the pay that you have all agreed to take. We must show the public that they have control, they have information, it is transparent what we are doing. And I'm sure that once these systems are in place and the public understands what it is that we are trying to do, the public will be on board and support the government in taking a different direction in achieving the goals and dreams and aspirations which we all desire, to see an efficient and effective public service. In closing, Madam Speaker, I want the Jamaican people to understand that we are on a journey towards transforming the quality, efficiency, and effectiveness of governance and public service in Jamaica. We have taken a massive step forward with this comprehensive restructuring of our system of public sector compensation. While critically important, compensation, Madam Speaker, is only one element. The government is determined, and we are moving forward with the complementary key element, which is accountability for performance. Madam Speaker, our mission is to ensure that the people of Jamaica enjoys the best public service, the best governance, and have access, Madam Speaker, to the best quality of leadership and governance that any country can have. May it please you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, Prime Minister, thank you for your presentation. The tabling of these two documents, the ministry paper dealing with job description for ministers of government and the green paper with a job description for members of parliament, is something which you had indicated would be coming, arising out of the furor which resulted from the implementation of the pay increase for ministers and parliamentarians. And we, for our part, are going to participate fulsomely in the discussion on the job description for members of parliament, seeking to further the quest for a transparent and clear description as to what members of parliament are expected to do, whether it be in their parliamentary duties or in their constituency duties, and what they are expected not to do as well. So I think this is an important exercise, and it will be very interesting to see how the draft that is in the green paper evolves through the Joint Select Committee. In terms of the ministry paper, obviously it's just been tabled and I've only had an opportunity to just flip through it. What I would say is that it does seem to contain largely general statements which are uncontroversial and not surprising. I haven't really seen anything that would suggest an embedding of an accountability framework within it for ministers, with some performance metrics that obviously wouldn't be in the ministry paper, but would be provided for, that would allow some measurement of performance. I'm not seeing that, but as I said, I haven't read it thoroughly yet. But I think that would be important for it to move beyond just a statement of principles or high-level ideas around what ministers ought to do and ought not to do, and to actually be something which could provide a mechanism for holding ministers accountable for their performance. Prime Minister, you mentioned some things in your presentation which reflect continuity across administrations. For example, the reforms to the Bank of Jamaica to increase its independence, to embed a monetary policy commission and inflation targeting. These are things which were agreed with the IMF initially. They weren't implemented at the time. They were deferred because there were many other things that had to be treated as more critical on the fiscal side, but were carried through with the support of both sides of the aisle and ultimately implemented in relation to the Bank of Jamaica through the amendments, I believe, in 2020. And indeed, the same is true of the Fiscal Commission. That is something that was agreed, that coming out of the EPOC experience, which was a voluntary arrangement, an innovation originated from the idea of there being a permanent institution to succeed from after EPOC had spent, when the IMF program came to an end, because the EPOC program or mechanism was really tied to monitoring the performance of the deliverables under the IMF agreement. That would never be a permanent arrangement, but the idea of there being an independent body to provide that kind of objectivity, assessment, monitoring, and scrutiny was an agreed position and has now been enacted. And indeed, the Fiscal Commissioner has been appointed, as I understand it. I'm not sure whether he has taken office yet, but we'll no doubt soon do so. Yes, building out the office. So there, and indeed, the idea of a restructuring of public sector compensation was committed to in 2015 with the unions and has been a while coming, and it's a very difficult exercise and has now reached an advanced stage. And, we had called for it from the announcement in the budget debate in 2022, I think it was. We had said, look, the principles of equity must dominate in how that restructuring was implemented. And in our view, that was not achieved because despite the 100 billion of additional resources per annum being spent on public sector compensation, the dissatisfactions with the outcome and the level of angst that it has led to is remarkable. And that is because large swathes of public sector employees, the rank and file, have not done very well out of the restructuring. When you take into account their net, what they're actually taking home, many of them feel worse off, or certainly don't feel that they've got anything near what they feel was justified. And it is in that context that the massive award to the ministers in particular and members of parliament was such a controversial decision taken by the government, including the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister talks about courage in implementing change, but when the heat came from that exercise, he decided, unilaterally it seems, to modify the decision so that prime ministerial pay was taken out of the list of increased salaries. So I don't know whether that was courageous or not, but he has indicated that he hasn't received any retroactive. So apparently it was implemented, as he said, in relation to him, but not in relation to the other ministers, obviously. So, Madam Speaker, all of this, I think, makes it even more appropriate that the terms of reference that were issued to the consultants and the consultants' report, the Ernst & Young report, the ENY report, that informed the entire approach to how the public sector reform was implemented and the decisions were made around how different elements within the public sector were to be awarded when the pie is being sliced up, ought to be released. And the Ministry of Finance's decision not to do so is extremely troubling. The idea that it can't be released because it's a draft really doesn't hold water, because it has been, the reform has been largely implemented already, and the report ought to be made public. The unions had asked for it during the negotiations. They weren't allowed to see it. And I think that was reprehensible. And at this point in time, to be told that
Your flow. Just on a point of order, that's not correct. With the greatest of respect, the report that's available, the report that is available, the Confederation of Trade Unions has been shared with them, has been shared with other unions as well. This is not a secret document. The headline that appeared in the newspaper, I saw that headline for the first time myself. In that the whatever transpired between the newspaper and technocrats at the ministry. So this is not a representation of my so saying two facts. One, the document that's available was shared with the Confederation of Trade Unions and shared with other unions as well. And two, the request that was made was not, usually they don't get through, they escalate, and it escalates and comes up to the minister and they ask, hey, what is happening? This time they chose not to escalate. They just went and printed. And I saw it in the newspaper for the first time, like everybody else. I just wanted to add that to the...
Sounds a bit like the FSC report on the SSL. But Madam Chair, on that issue, the minister said the report that is available. What does he mean by that? What report is he referring to? All I can tell you is that the unions who I discussed the matter with over the months said they had not seen the ENY report. And the minister has chosen those words carefully, no doubt, when he speaks to the report that is available. And that what we're being told is that the report that has been requested is a draft and is not going to be released, and they're relying on some provision in the Access to Information Act to deny access to it to the public. And I think that's a bad thing. It's not transparent. And I urge the minister, who apparently didn't even know that decision was made, which is a surprise to say the least, countermands it and releases the report. So, Madam Speaker, we look forward to the Joint Select Committee. I'm a little perplexed about the approach that's being taken to the Code of Conduct, though. Typically, a Joint Select Committee will be reviewing a document, normally legislation, but not necessarily limited to that. But there will be something that has been generated by government, which is brought to Parliament and is sent to a Joint Select Committee for review. In this instance, based on what the Prime Minister said, it almost seems as if the Joint Select Committee is to be tasked with generating a code itself. The process of how Joint Select Committees typically work doesn't really lend itself to that, but it will be interesting to see how the actual modalities of that Joint Select Committee will be implemented so as to enable it to be an entity that can actually create a code from scratch by reference to examples that exist abroad and so on. But that's not normally how Joint Select Committees work. I would have thought that a code of conduct, a draft, a proposal, a green paper would have been brought to Parliament, which could then be analyzed and perhaps amended substantially, but would at least form a basis for discussions rather than seeking to have this Joint Select Committee initiate something itself, which may be difficult. But we will withhold judgment on that, and we look forward to participating in it. And, it should be, as I say, at the end of the day, if we produce a good code and job descriptions that everybody feels are fair and balanced, it will be an improvement on the situation which exists today, where so many people don't really understand what members of Parliament do or are able to do and expect of them things which are really not within their remit, or they don't have the resources or capacity to implement. So having the code will, I think, hopefully improve public understanding of the scope, the possibilities, and the limitations of being an MP. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Madam Speaker, just very quickly, I wanted to just look at two issues, probably some questions to the Prime Minister on the job description for members of Parliament. I'm looking forward as well to the Joint Select Committee for the discussion of it. I want, though, to say, the Prime Minister has a way of looking at opinions that don't coincide with his as being persons who don't have the country's interest at heart, who working with common sense without intelligence. And I believe that, or fool, I just believe, I believe that when our leaders approach opinions of Jamaicans, patriotic Jamaicans, who have their only interest is a better country, a government that's run on good governance, that drop government badness, a government that doesn't attack individuals who don't agree. I believe when you go down that road that it is bad, it's a bad precedent, very, very bad precedent. And in fact, we have seen throughout all of what has been happening that is the attempt that the government is making. Madam Speaker, overreach of government in today's world is something that everyone looks out for. It is something that we are sworn when we come here to make sure we prevent. We are also sworn to defend the rights of the Jamaican people. And I wanted to say, without fear or favor, that no matter what badness anyone comes in here with, no matter the words anyone uses inside here, you are not going to get us on this side to stop talking about those things that we believe are wrong. We are going to continue talking on behalf of the Jamaican people. And Madam Speaker, I could not leave this parliament without putting it squarely on the table, because we are here, every single member, sent here by the good people of their constituency, who have voted for them, who they meet with from time to time, who they discuss their issues with, and who come here, as you say in here, to advocate and to represent. You might feel uncomfortable when it's done, but I'm going to tell you, get used to it, because it won't change.
Madam Speaker, I want to thank the members for their enthusiastic participation in the debate. It is very meaningful. Today, and it's limited, and I appreciate the limit on that side because of, and I'm saying thank you to the members for it. So Madam Speaker, let me start with my sister and neighbor, the member from St. Andrews Southwest. Madam Speaker, it is apparent that she is also bristling from opinions for which she does not find favor. Absolutely. So, Madam Speaker, in the cut and thrust of debate, we can make our points strenuously, strongly, stridently, but respectfully. So, Madam Speaker, there is nothing that I have said in the debate that was not respectful and with dignity. Madam Speaker, I have to speak the truth as I see it. And it, Madam Speaker, it may not accord with the opposition. And they are obviously not comfortable with it. But in our parliament, in this body, this is where we must express ourselves. Madam Speaker, I have no fear of the opinions of others. And what you will see from my presentation is that I have been listening. So I pay attention to what you say. I pay attention to what the leader of the opposition says. I pay attention to almost, sometimes I think it's information overload. But it's my duty to absorb as much information as possible so that I understand where the people are. Now, Madam Speaker, I believe that the people of Jamaica want to see accountability in the parliament. They want to see our parliament act maturely and take charge of themselves. Madam Speaker, they want a framework for performance. They want to see their members of parliament representing. And I believe that what we have done today is a step in this journey of improving our parliament. Madam Speaker, there is a four-dimensional framework with which we can assess our parliament. Our parliament must be representative, it must be responsive, it must have oversight, Madam Speaker, and the fourth element, I have it right here with the MPs, is that it must be deliberative. So clearly, this parliament is not short of deliberations. So my sister, the member from Southwest St. Andrew, was complaining that our deliberations might be too strong, but we deliberate. We don't argue, but we exchange views, we deliberate. Madam Speaker, the parliament is becoming more representative, certainly in a demographic way. We're having more women in our parliament, more young people in our parliament. The parliament is beginning to reflect the demographic structure of the society. Where we fall short, Madam Speaker, is that the parliament does not execute its oversight responsibility as much as it should. And that is because our committee systems are not working as effectively as they should. And that is not, Madam Speaker, I know when I open that door, the leader of the opposition will be quick to point out that because we have changed. But I would point out very quickly, that there was a reason, and a strong reason, why the parliament was structured in that way. In what way? In the way that certain sessional committees were chaired by government members, while others were chaired by opposition members. Prime Minister Golding, in being magnanimous and wanting to usher in a new spirit of parliamentary cooperation, changed that system to allow all sessional committees to be chaired by the opposition. Well, what was the result? Was there any greater oversight? No. The reason why it was structured the way in which it was is that the motivation for oversight is different depending on which side of the aisle you're on. So, for example, the chairmanship of the Economic Committee and Infrastructure Committee, the chairmanship of the Human Resources Committee is quite different from the motivation of the chairmanship of the PAC or the PAAC. So those committees, the PAC and the PAAC, are best chaired by opposition members. But for the enforcement and oversight of the implementation of government policy, you want your MPs who are vested in seeing outcomes and success of government policy, pursuing the government entities. It is, Madam Speaker, it is a false notion to believe that oversight is only given or is only the duty of opposition members. That is not the case. Oversight is the remit and duty of all members of the government, in particular, all those who are classified as being on the backbenches of Parliament. That is the role of your backbench. And all I wanted to do, Madam Speaker, was to empower the backbenches of Parliament to be more effective in conducting oversight of the government. So, Madam Speaker, we're going to get there. We're going to build our new Parliament, which I will come in another couple of weeks to give an update as to where we are with the Parliament. We will have our rooms for conducting our oversight meetings in a much regular way so that we can hold our government to account and get more results out of our government. Madam Speaker, we will get our parliamentary committees to meet. We will get them to conduct the oversight that they should of the various ministries and departments. All the members of parliament on this side, Madam Speaker, are seized of the new dispensation. They understand that this new salary increase is not for nothing. There must be visible and tangible work that comes with this increase in salary. Madam Speaker, very quickly, the leader of the opposition was very gracious in accepting the ministry papers that were tabled. He pointed out that it would be unusual in practice for the Joint Select Committee not to have something before it. Madam Speaker, the Joint Select Committee will have before it the ministry paper that was developed for ministers, Ministry Paper 19/2002, which is the Code of Conduct for Ministers. So it will have that as a base document. We will also give the Joint Select Committee background documents. In other words, Madam Speaker, we have prepared a code of conduct, but we have to be careful, Madam Speaker, that a select group does not direct the Parliament. So, Madam Speaker, because this code of conduct is going to be so binding on everyone, we will give them some base and background documents for them to work with, including documents that are already before Parliament. But in this instance, the Joint Select Committee will have to do some work as well. And it is not new ground. There are volumes and volumes of documents and parliaments that already have created codes of conduct. And Madam Speaker, we have the support and assistance of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Group and all other kinds of agencies that can assist. So I expect that the committee will have, as the leader of the opposition pointed out, some base documents from which to work, but we do expect them to take some initiative to pull documents in, to pull support in, and to collaborate with other parliaments in determining this code of conduct. Madam Speaker, it is not an unbounded assignment. We are expecting, Madam Speaker, that within 6 months, they should be able to report to the Parliament substantial progress on the work to be carried out. Madam Speaker, the job description for ministers is quite comprehensive. And I understand the position of the leader of the opposition that he has not had an opportunity to read it. And so his comments are acceptable, that upon first reading, it may seem general. But I'm certain that after you've had an opportunity to read it, you will see that it does give a very good framework for understanding the role and functions of ministers. And in effect, by highlighting what is called the key deliverables and key responsibility areas, we have actually created a framework by which ministers can be held to account by the public. So this document is now for public consumption, and the public will be able to read all of these duties and responsibilities and determine for themselves whether or not a minister is fulfilling all these duties. Madam Speaker, this document did not attempt to set our hat where we know we can reach it. This document is very aspirational. And indeed, when the cabinet was making the determination, there was quite a bit of debate about whether or not we should put all of what we have put in the document. But Madam Speaker, I think the public will generally be satisfied with the details of the roles and responsibilities of ministers. The document for members of Parliament is still in draft form, and I'm expecting that the members will improve on the document and make it even more aspirational than it is now. So with those comments, Madam Speaker, I thank you and I thank the members.
Madam Speaker, I now move for the motion to be Yeah. Madam Speaker, I beg to give notice on behalf of the Prime Minister that at the next meeting of the House, I will move. Be it resolved that this Honorable House appoint a select committee comprising the following members. 1. Honorable Marissa Dalrymple Filbert, Chairman. 2. Most Honorable Juliet Holness. 3. Dr. Christopher Tufton. 4. Honorable Floyd Green. 5. Ms. Crystal Lee. 6. Mr. Donovan Williams. 7. Mr. Julian Robinson. 8. Mrs. Natalie Nita Garvey, to sit jointly with a similar committee to be appointed by the Honorable Senate to examine and consider 1. The Ministry Paper number 69/2023, dated June 20, 2023, entitled Job Descriptions of Ministers of Government. 2. Green Paper number 03/2023, dated June 2023, entitled Job Descriptions for Members of Parliament of Jamaica. And 3. Code of Conduct for Parliamentarians. And to recommend a plan of action for the implementation of standards for performance and accountability and provide report of its findings to this Honorable House. Madam Speaker, I further beg to give notice that at a later stage today, I will move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take the motion.
Public business.
Madam Speaker, I now move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take the motion, notice of which I gave earlier.
Members, the question before the House is that there be the suspension of standing orders to enable the House Leader to take the motion, notice of which he gave earlier. Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. House Leader.
Madam Speaker, the matter having been fully ventilated, I now move for the adoption of the motion.
Members, the question before the House is that the motion be adopted. Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it.
Madam Speaker, I now move for the suspension of the standing orders, enable me to take the more resolution, notes of which I gave earlier.
Members, the question before the House is that there's a suspension of the standing orders to enable the member to take the motion, notice of which he gave earlier. Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it.
Madam Speaker, consistent with the requirements on the law reforms on the special operations, special security, and community development measures, right? We are again seeking extension for the 7 areas that are currently declared zones of special operations. These zones which are in the communities of Mount Salem. All right. Mount Salem, Denham Town, August Town, Greenwich Town, Norwood, Parade Gardens, and Savlamar will expand June 24, 2023. As Speaker, I wish to indicate that the outset that the as I'm about to indicate to my colleagues that the final work of law reforms on special operation amendment bill will this time be with the drafts very shortly. We have had some delays and unnecessarily. I'll have it. I think we'll have to do one more 60-day renewal. It's a reflection of the capacity of the legislative work of the team that we have. No, we're going to get through this time. I'm saying it because it has been nobody is comfortable with what's happening. It just myself personally, the members of the House are going through the same thing routinely, and the Solicitor General agencies who are dealing with this thing each step. It's distracting. but there are some, we are acutely aware of the legislative challenge we sometimes have. So, Madam Speaker, on the advice, acting on the advice of the National Security Council, in accordance with law reforms on special operations, special security, and committee measures act, in accordance with Section 5 of the Act, which states that the Prime Minister and Council, after considering the joint command made by order subject to affirmative resolution of the House of Representatives, extend the period referred to in Section 4.3 as the Mount Salem Denham Town, August Town, Greenwich Town, Norwood, Parade Garden, and Savlamar zones of special operations, special security, and community development measures for a further period of 60 days to the 24th of August 2023. Madam Speaker, the work continued in all three zones. We have had impact. I think the members are familiar with the outcome. Most of them are in the build phase. There are some delays in terms of budget, but I know that Jamaica Social Investment Fund is moving to begin the build phase in pretty much all of the areas that we are now operating in. But the work continues all of them with significant success. We have had a couple of, we have had on the margins of two of the zones, particularly in Norwood and in Mount Salem, incident of shooting. The outcome in that those incidents no wish reflects a failure of the zones of special operation, but the zone did not seek to eliminate totally all those who are inclined to violence. What came out of that, in the areas where this happened, the police intelligence has got required information on the videos very quickly, and in fact are tracking those who were perpetrators, and we expect to bring those areas under significant control. The overall figures demonstrate there have been significant reduction in all areas, and the work to effect social economic transformation continues. We're doing a number of other things to expand the activity in the other areas designated, if not as zones, but in terms of social intervention across the critical vulnerable communities. Madam Speaker, on the basis of that, we seek for affirmation of the House to extend the 7 zones that are currently in operation.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'll be very short. This is now almost a routine activity. I'm hoping it's the last time we come back for this kind of yes, with this frequency.
At this frequency.
Right. The minister spoke about some of what has been happening, and he did mention that within the areas of the Zozo, it is impossible to eliminate all the individuals that are prone to violence. I wanted the minister to say, because that's certainly our experience, whenever we have, as we have had during this period, persons being shot, persons being murdered, it tends to dilute and to shake the confidence of members of the community in the capacity of the operation to really keep them safe. And I believe that it is extremely important for us to look at what can be done so that, especially in those areas where we still have those kinds of incursions, what else can be done? What isn't being done that could be done? Again, I also want to say, and I speak, I know I have a general responsibility for to look at everything, but I am the member for Southwest St. Andrew, where the Greenwich Towns also falls. And we are paying the minister that in terms of the kind of second chance youth at risk program, especially because the constituency benefited before this from a significant national unattached youth program, which is no more and which we have not been able to access. I have asked the questions in the Parliament. We have not been able to hear what is similar, replace it. In constituencies and communities like these, this is an important part of engaging youngsters and luring them away from the influence of the gangs or near gangs and so on. And I must say that I am disappointed, Minister, that we have not been able to do more in the Greenwich Town Division, and in particular in the area that is affected by the Zozo, especially because we still see some of the behavior that I'm sure that by now we would have hoped we would have eliminated. So I want to commend that to you, Minister. One, to see what else we can do, and two, around the education, skills training, certification programs, so that our youngsters can really have hope and can see a change against the background of us talking about the Zozo and what it is supposed to achieve.
1 second.
Okay.
Minister, just wanted to say, I noticed that these new orders expire on the 24th of August. So we are going to have to come back here in the middle of August to further extend them. And, you know, all of this is because the amendments to the Zozo legislation still haven't come. And I mean, this is critical legislation for the national security apparatus of the country. It is a main legislation that is now being operationalized on an ongoing basis. Why aren't the amendments being prioritized? And I would say bring them here before the summer recess, and let us try and expedite those amendments through so that we don't have to return here in the middle of the summer recess just to go through the formality of extending these Zozos for another 60 days. Let's have that legislation brought before that so we can avoid this problem. Thank you.
Minister, there's an understanding that there is the understanding that the resource limitation and what the Zozo really represents ensures that we don't have the Zozos in places that need them, but we just can't afford them at the moment. However, we've long had the discussion about some targeted kinds of interventions. I have been at pains to talk about the same two interventions now for years. And I've had the undertaking from you that we'll address it, but nothing has happened and continues to happen. So, Minister, I'm just simply saying to you, that there are important other social inventions, right? So So, Minister, I really would, my constituents who have heard me speaking about the unfinished music center and the Brook Valley educational trade, and the Brook Valley, the one in Brook Valley and the one in unfinished business in Waterhouse, the center, the music studio, and the Brook Valley Center. We have spoken about that, and I'd love to see that these communities are vulnerable communities. Each of them you know quite well. Right? And so I'm just simply repeating again what I've been saying. We really do need the attention, because even as if the Zozo comes when it comes, fine. But before we do that, I think we can do some targeted programs to address some situations that are current and existing.
I share the member from South Centre of the concern. I mean, if I had, in before today, this week, significant discussion with my team. We have had some loss of staff, etc., but we're going to move on. In fact, I did seek the commitment to try and get it here before the summer. But of course, the day is very, but we're going to get it here early. It is as much a distress to me and almost an embarrassment to me as a minister, having delayed it. I remember I got the corporation of the House pushed hard and got the amendments done in a timely manner. And but we get it done so that we can, this particular piece of legislation is the one that has commons across the floor, and that is an effective piece of legislation. We have to extend the funding so we can in fact move into all the areas. And even before we put in the full security operation begins now the operation. That's what we're now doing with the school support. I think the unofficial is 1 in 54 schools. We're going to a number of schools in several communities that's socially zoned, but some outside of the area. And the financial support for that is in place and should begin expenditure pretty soon over the summer. I'm not forgetting your school, the issue of introduction of music, where we use music, sports, and technology in the community. It has proven to be very effective in attracting the youngsters, and therefore, once we get their ear, to provide guidance. The engagement of our young people from the zones is supposed to be ongoing. I think there's been a little gap largely, but Hart has been going through a level of almost repurposing by the minister responsible, the prime minister. He's very keen on extending numbers of people who can engage. So I expect very shortly you'll see the results, because that is part of the role of the zones, is to begin to focus the entire program in those areas and provide alternative in terms of training for those young men who are out of school, and to get those who are in that 15 to 18 group in particular back in some kind of organized program outside of, even if they're not yet competent for JNSC. It's something I'm paying particular attention to, and I think in both members who spoke here from Southwest Center and Western St. Andrew, I'm sure that the technical officers involved will be in touch with you as to what's happening. JSF in particular is still working in your area, and there are a number of things to be done. And I expect that the need to engage, as I said, those young unattached youths is a critical part of the program will be fully activated. It's not in the same original format, but getting them into formal training and organized. We're doing both in the public sector. The private sector is doing some work, which is very good, and in fact relates to the same kind of activity, and we tend to expand that. But so that's where we'll be going. So we expect to keep the zones active in the areas that I've identified, and therefore seek the House support once again. And as I said, I hope to ensure that as the amendments come, when we have the debates, there'll be more to discuss in a meaningful way. And look at the statistics really over a 6-month to a year period. We can see how effective the program is being executed, and therefore the need to expand, change direction, or work again in getting that particular program going or keeping it on track as it should. It is the kind of program that can make a big difference once we can scale it to the level that we would like, which means reaching across more of the 100 challenge communities that have been identified by the Planning Institute. Once we get into enough of those communities on an ongoing basis, I'm confident we can begin to not only reduce the level of violence, but in fact really significantly, but to really get that downward trend and to return our communities to normal civilized behavior. That more, Madam Speaker, I thank the members of the House and seek their support to continue the zones of special operation, the 7 identified areas.
Members, the question before the House is that the resolutions 7 that were brought by the minister be now approved. Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. The resolutions have been approved. House Leader?
Madam Speaker, is not intended to do any further business for the day.